BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. BlackBoxNid88 on Instagram for the bonus podcast. And welcome to BBOR, the home of true crime talk radio and your premier destination for unsolved mysteries, criminal psychology, and exploring the dark side of cyberspace. My name is Ned DeHaan, and I am your host, as well as the creator of AstroPsych 400 here on YouTube, and regular contributor to the Zodiac Killer channel. And a great way to support these shows is just by listening to some more content. But you can also go over to Amazon.com and have a look at the book Killer on a White Horse, written by me, Ned DeHaan. It is a novel, murder mystery, inspired by the Zodiac Manson connection, but it is indeed fictional. However, who doesn't love a good mystery? And there is always the TeeSpring page. Feel free to check out some of the merchandise. And remember, being weird is not a crime. Let the show begin. Alright, hello everybody. Today is Monday, another Zodiac Monday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? I hope everyone had a good weekend. As the introduction states, I am also a regular contributor to the Zodiac Killer channel, and there are several different productions out there. One of them is the podcast Serial Killer Z to A, which focuses on, firstly, the Zodiac Killer. That will be the subject for Season 1, and you can get that anywhere you get your podcasts, including iHeartRadio and Spotify. But I've been through most of the Zodiac Killer channel's videos, and I've referenced them in a lot of episodes here on BlackBoxOnlineRadio, and I think some of you guys in the audience would really enjoy their episode when they do the readings and the recreations of the Zodiac Killer letters. And there's also a good reading of them done on the channel next Halloween. I think that those are always good references. But one video I haven't watched until recently is the episode on Robert Vaughn as a Zodiac Killer suspect. And Robert Vaughn makes an appearance in the 2007 Fincher film, and perhaps that's one of the reasons why a lot of people know his name and talk about him in contemporary circles. But Bob Vaughn is and was a different type of Zodiac suspect because he is heavily connected to an individual named Rick Marshall. And almost certainly this is going to turn into a partnership theory. Bob Vaughn was born in 1912 and he passed away in 2002 at the age of 90. And some of you are instantly thinking, well, if this guy was born in 1912, the Zodiac Killer was operating in 1969, or at least the first confirmed crime, that is. And if he's going to be starting in 1968, committing murders in 1969, then he would have been 57 years old. Much older than any of the witness descriptions. And the Zodiac Killer channel even talked about that, about how the age range of witness descriptions is mostly from 25 to 45. From the Blue Rock Springs shooting, 25, and after the Stein murder, 45. Not exactly 45, I believe it says early 40s in the police report. But with somebody such as Robert Vaughn, I don't think that there's a very widely held belief that he could have done the entire thing by himself, but he is more or less thought of as an active participant in the Zodiac Killer's crimes. Rick Marshall being the murderer, and Robert Vaughn being an active participant, most notably the letter writer, saying that he had similar handwriting. And Marshall and Vaughn worked in a silent movie theater, where Rick Marshall was the projectionist, and Robert Vaughn was the musician playing the piano. And as I understand it, that's how they did things back in the 1920s, like when they had these old-fashioned silent movies. They weren't just called that because there was no dialogue. There wasn't even music in them, in the originals. So when they would play them in the movie theater, someone would actually play the piano or the organ live, and one person who did that was Robert Vaughn. As far as being a musician goes, the Zodiac frequently referenced the musical operetta The Mikado by Gilbert and Sullivan. I mean, we're talking about very frequently. That almost seems to be somewhat of an obsession for the Zodiac. But an interesting theory that some people have is that the Zodiac Killer wasn't actually inspired by Gilbert and Sullivan. It could have been the Groucho Marx version of the Mikado. But if you'd like to hear more about that, I have an episode called Clues in the Mikado that focuses on more or less a direct response to the Gilbert and Sullivan version. And there are almost an enormous amount of solid direct references to movies and film all throughout the Zodiac Killer's chronology. And on ZodiacKiller.com, it even states that in 1974, the Zodiac resurfaced again. The Zodiac mailed letters into 1971, almost no confirmed activity, no solid confirmed activity for 1972 and 73, and then in 1974, the Zodiac resurfaces with the Exorcist letter. Then there's the Red Phantom letter, which could be a reference to the film El Spectro Rojo, and then there's even the Badlands card. So it appears that if those are indeed authentic Zodiac communications, then the Zodiac is being a little bit more obsessive about movies, or it's possible that there are countless movie references that have been tied in to the Zodiac lore, one of which that is even discussed in the Fincher film is The Most Dangerous Game. And now the Zodiac Killer mailed something called the 408 Cipher, which says, "I like killing people because it's so much fun. It's more fun than hunting wild game in the forest, because man is the most dangerous animal of all." And that could be a reference to The Most Dangerous Game, which is a short story, but it could also be referring to either the film version, and I'll share some stuff about that later on in the episode, or it could be referring to a remake or a parody, perhaps the remake such as the film Bloodlust from 1961, which is a retelling of the story. Very similar elements, just the characters are different and done in the 1960s. They are resembling more of the 1960s fashion. You'll see some dark-rimmed glasses and crew haircuts in that one. But as far as this operation goes, a partnership, a tag team, a duo, two people being involved in the Zodiac Killer mystery, I think that it's widely discussed, and people get curious about it. I've been curious about it. I did the episode Arthur Lee Allen's partner back in 2018 because it just came to mind. What if the Zodiac had a partner? Is that how this person did not get caught? Because there were two people involved. There's a little bit of his evidence left behind, and there's a little bit of his evidence left behind. And that's the ultimate answer to everything. And not only that, a lot of people have thought about it. However, most people don't seem to think about Rick Marshall and Bob Vaughn as a Zodiac Killer tag team, or Zodiac Killer participants. Instead, a more widely discussed one is Arthur Lee Allen and Don Chaney being involved. Now, in what capacity? Those will vary in some different theories, but that one has been widely discussed by Drew Beeson, author of Sighting In on the Zodiac Killer, as well as the host of the Zodcast. But there's an interesting variant of this partnership tag team theory that comes to us from Mike Rodelli, of all people. Mike Rodelli, author of In the Shadow of Mount Diablo and The Hunt for Zodiac. And I'm putting two and two together a little bit, but it's my understanding that perhaps before Mike Rodelli endorsed the Zodiac suspect Shel Cavalli, he began to formulate this theory that there could have been two killers. You have a letter writer who only committed one murder, and that would have been the Lake Berryessa stabbing, which led to the murder of Cecilia Shepard. Brian Hartnell was the other victim in the Lake Berryessa stabbing, but he survived. That means that one person committed the Lake Herman Road murders and the Blue Rock Springs shooting and the Stein murder. But the person who committed the Lake Berryessa stabbing was a different person, and the reason why is all of the differences. You have someone who is estimated to have been a little bit taller. The Blue Rock Springs shooter and the Stein shooter were both estimated to have been roughly around 5 feet 8 inches tall, maybe 5'10". Yet the Lake Berryessa stabber was estimated to have been 6 feet tall by Cecilia Shepard. Also, the killers having an extended conversation with the victims. The killer was wearing the famous Zodiac hood for the only time. The victims were tied up. The victims were stabbed. All of these are very different than that of other Zodiac crimes. But there was a message written on the car door with very similar handwriting. Now, what Rodelli was thinking is that it is possible that the letter writer only actually committed one of the murders and then wrote the message on the car door, and that's why it looks so similar, because he didn't commit the other murders, and that's just leaving a signature behind that there were two people involved. And this has also been discussed by Thomas Henry Horan, who is the author of The Myth of the Zodiac Killer, and a supporter of the Zodiac hoax theory, that there could have been multiple killers, and someone wrote letters taking credit for crimes that he didn't commit. But then, if that's the case, how did this similar handwriting end up on the car door at Lake Berryessa from somebody who would have committed the crime while wearing the Zodiac symbol? I mean, the Zodiac has the Zodiac symbol on his costume at Lake Berryessa, and then writes another Zodiac symbol on the car door, wrote the word Vallejo, wrote the dates of Zodiac activity, and wrote the word by knife. Okay, so that goes to show that there is definite familiarity with the Zodiac events. But what Thomas Horan shared is that the Zodiac symbol was published in the newspaper on August 4th of 1969 in the Vallejo Times-Herald. I believe it's not on the cover, I believe it's on the inside page, and the Zodiac would then complain that he didn't get front page coverage, but it was published in the Vallejo Times-Herald more than a month before the Lake Berryessa stabbing, so somebody not only would have seen the Zodiac symbol in the paper, but also been exposed to the handwriting. And someone could have copied the handwriting practiced, or it could have just simply been a good forgery, and that would work in a copycat theory or in a partnership theory. But when looking at Bob Vaughn and Rick Marshall, excuse me, their partnership theory would mostly stem on Rick Marshall committing the murders and Bob Vaughn writing the letters, and you can see different elements from their backgrounds being put in place. A movie projectionist would have had certain knowledge about technology, and the Zodiac would go on to draw out a bomb diagram, plus with the fact that Bob Vaughn would have been a musician, tying it in not only to the Mikado and musicals and movies, but the Zodiac Killer was almost certainly inspired by the film Charlie Chan at Treasure Island, which was not only discussed on the Zodiac Killer channel, but even here on Black Box Online Radio. If you watch that movie, absolutely that was an influence on the Zodiac Killer. I mean, 99% that the Zodiac was recreating events from Charlie Chan at Treasure Island, because it's all about how there's this character named Dr. Zodiac who's a murderer and leaving cryptic messages, and I mean, yes, I believe the Zodiac was inspired by that film. But we've talked about several different partnership theories before already at this point in the episode. To give some counterbalance, I would like to go to a comment that was written out by Richard Grinnell of ZodiacCyphers.com, and he wrote this out for a Facebook group, actually. This is from the Zodiac Killer Library, which states, "The nature of each crime and the ballistics evidence do not require more than one person to have committed the murders. We can speculate on more than one killer and suggest possibilities, but there is no solid evidence to confirm two or more killers as more probable than one." Okay, two or more killers. But as I said, with Vaughn and Marshall, that mostly turns into a partnership theory involving someone just being involved with the composition and writing of the letters, and then someone else is involved with the murders. The two people were in on this. And as far as Don Chaney and Arthur Lee Allen, I think that Drew Beeson is going to expand more on this possibility in the future, that the two of them could have concocted the story as a novel or a fictional idea, maybe even a movie idea, something to that effect. They began discussing it and then decided to take the fictional story, or I'm tempted to avoid this word, but the fantasy, and then turn it into a reality. I've heard Drew mention that briefly on his show, The Zodcast, but we can see exactly if some more dots will be connected. And to give some info that I've given to you guys in the past, I do not believe that Rick Marshall was the Zodiac killer, because Marshall was just an attention seeker, a goofball, an odd and eccentric individual, someone who is just making a mockery of the whole scene. And I don't believe that that's consistent with the Zodiac killer's behavior. Instead, I think that that is more consistent with someone who is just trolling people. Before there were internet trolls, there was Rick Marshall, and that is my take on the subject. And I know it's not the most thorough debunking, but I just have to throw that in there. And I think that that also reduces Bob Vaughn's likely involvement. However, not only from the Fincher film, but also comments from Greensmith, they did think that Bob Vaughn had some of the most similar handwriting to the Zodiac killer's letters. But I would actually like to discuss a new Zodiac killer suspect that was shared to me by somebody named Robert O., who sent this in to the email address. Anybody can write the show at BlackBoxOnlineRadio at AOL.com, and Robert O. wanted to propose a suspect with a similar name, Robert E. Hunter. And there are several reasons for this. Robert E. Hunter was in California in Riverside in 1966 at the time of the murder of Sherry Jo Bates. And even though I've stated that I don't believe the Zodiac killer committed a murder in 1966, Robert O. has shared a possibility about how he thinks that Robert E. Hunter was not only present, but also overlooked by the police, and you might be noticing his initials, R.H., that ties into something called the desktop poem, which was found more or less 2 months after the Bates murder, which says, sick of living, unwilling to die. And it talks about blood spilled all over her red dress, oh well, it was red anyway, and it is signed with the initials R.H. To help us out, I would like to read his obituary, actually, that was posted on Legacy.com. Robert E. Hunter, Jr. was born on May 23rd of 1922, and he passed away on October 1st of 2013. So he would have been roughly 47 years old during the bulk of Zodiac activity, much younger than Bob Vaughn, but still an older Zodiac killer suspect. Robert Hunter was born in Pasadena, California, to Robert and Gwendolyn Hunter. Bob, as he was known to his multiple friends, was the younger brother of Helen and Louise. He graduated from Yale in 1945 and was a second lieutenant in the U.S. Marine Corps, where he participated in the occupation of Japan after the Second World War. Hunter began his banking career at Bankers Trust in New York City, where he met his first wife, Sylvia Morton. The couple moved to San Francisco in 1949, where he became a banker at the Crocker National Bank, specializing in agricultural loans. His territory included the Pacific Northwest and Hawaii, and he spent summers as a teenager on the Parker Ranch on the Big Island of Hawaii. He enjoyed working with his clients, many of whom became close friends. While fishing and hunting, he was also a limited partner at Brown Brothers Harriman, the investment banking firm in New York. Bob loved the outdoors. He enjoyed hunting and fishing all over the world, including grouse hunting in Scotland, elk hunting in the dead of winter in Montana, and dove and duck hunting in Texas and Alabama, and of course his native California. He fished in Scotland, British Columbia, Montana, Idaho, and wherever there was a stream to land a fly. He would take his family on pack trips, mostly throughout the summers in the West. In his early 50s, he purchased a cattle breeding ranch in Glen Ellen in the Sonoma Valley, but his plan to plant grapes and develop what would become the world's smallest champagne house in California went on. With the help of his second wife Anne, a talented landscaper, Robert Hunter launched the Robert Hunter Winery, and it became a touted destination, for those seeking a spectacular sparkling wine. Bob was always a generous member of the community. He served on boards of the San Francisco Zoological Society, the Point Reyes Bird Observatory, Guide Dogs for the Blind, the California Pacific Medical Center, and the Hannah Boyce Center in Sonoma, to name a few. He was a lifelong member of the Bohemian Club, where in his early years he enjoyed performing on Thursday nights. He was also a member of the Pacific Union Club, the Burlingame Country Club, and the San Francisco Golf Club, and one of the founding members of the Alpine Meadows in Lake Tahoe. Bob passed away peacefully at his ranch with his family by his side, and then it goes on to share some details about his family, but this is an obituary that was originally published in the Reno Gazette, but made available on Legacy.com. Did you see any Zodiac clues in that particular one? Firstly, the connection to banking, talking about working in banks. And before any of the movies, I would like to go to the short story Sign Z by Edwin Baird, which talks again about a fictional character named Z who commits murders and then says, "This is Z calling." And I believe definitely that that was a direct inspiration on the Zodiac Killer. But if you read that story, you'll see that Z, the killer Z, is targeting presidents of banks. I mean, and no matter what, I wholeheartedly also believe that Sign Z by Edwin Baird, which was originally published in Detective Story magazine in 1921, was an inspiration on the Zodiac Killer. So that is something that stood out to me. Now, he worked for Brown Brothers Harriman briefly. We're going to have to go back to them. We're discussing some conspiracy theory episodes and the conspiracy theories that are most likely true. But what Robert O. wanted me to look at is that twice it talks about Montana in his obituary, and the Zodiac Killer possibly had a Montana connection. The Zodiac committed the Lake Berryessa stabbing, where he's wearing the costume and he approaches Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard at gunpoint, and then he's holding them up, and he then has them tied up first. Cecilia ties up Brian's hands, and then the Zodiac adds more restraints and then ties up Cecilia. They're all at gunpoint, mind you. So that's how the Zodiac maintained control of the situation. But then the Zodiac Killer, telling the story at Lake Berryessa, and yes, these events are out of order, but the Zodiac's telling the story about how he's an escaped prison convict, he killed 2 guards escaping prison in Montana, and it's possible that he even said Deer Lodge Prison in Montana, that he was at Deer Lodge Prison, and that he's en route to Mexico, and he just needs a car to get to Mexico. I know it must have seemed so weird that some guy's wearing this hooded costume with a Zodiac symbol on it, and he's telling this bizarre, wacky story about, "I'm an escaped prison convict. I killed a guard in Montana at Deer Lodge Prison. All I want is your money. I'm trying to get to Mexico." If that had happened to me, I have no idea how I would truly responded, but I would just guess I would be like, WTF, what is going on? I mean, that just seems so amazingly bizarre. And I was talking about the David Fincher film earlier, and the first time I watched that, I didn't think too much of their Lake Berryessa stabbing recreation. However, that is the segment of the movie that I watch over and over again, and each time you watch it, it becomes a little bit more horrific, and just if that were to actually happen to you, it's just a little bit more terrifying each time. But as far as Montana goes, if the Zodiac Killer did say Montana, then he might have had familiarity with that location because he went there on hunting trips. And people have also talked about how the Zodiac Killer could have been a big game hunter. That's why he showed almost no hesitation when he was stabbing the victims. Although Brian Hartnell did state that the killer's hands were shaking a little bit, maybe stabbing a deer versus stabbing a person is something different, but the Zodiac Killer could have even had the knife because of hunting. He may have even had the belt and the sheath that were used also on hunting trips, and some of that is guesswork, but it shows that Montana is mentioned twice. So there are a couple of different elements that I do think are genuine Zodiac Killer connections. He was a graduate of Yale University in 1945, and then in the United States Marine Corps, goes to Japan, and it says after the Second World War, but close thereabouts. A lot of people believe that the Zodiac Killer had a military connection. Michael Cole, author of the Zodiac Revisited trilogy, makes a very convincing case that the Zodiac was either ex-Navy or ex-Air Force, but a second lieutenant in the Marine Corps is not too far off, and some people think that the Zodiac Killer got his ideas from the military, particularly the ciphers, which I haven't talked about too much in this episode, briefly mentioning the 408 cipher, but that the Zodiac composed these cryptograms and ciphers with all the odd symbols. And not only did he learn about coding from the military, but the ideas that are used in the ciphers could have come from places like being stationed in Asia, and there are actually reshaping of certain Asian belief systems, although it's only been briefly discussed that they actually came from Japan. I mean, very briefly. But I have to just jump in right there. I know I'm just trying to lay out some of the ideas for you guys, but I did an episode recently when I was looking at a simple code book that had been shared with me by Bruce. Thank you for that one again. And it's a code book from 1969, actually, and there are all types of different ways that you can create simple codes, and mostly it doesn't require any type of extensive military training. If you had a little code manual or something like this, you would be able to compose the Zodiac Killer's ciphers. And I'm saying that as someone who does not know the solutions to the Zodiac Killer's Z13 cipher, as well as the Z32 cipher. But I mean, I just think that needs to be reiterated. The Zodiac didn't need military training to create the cryptograms. But we can look more into Robert Hunter in the future and see if we can find out more about him. The final point that Robert O wanted to share with me is that he thought that this guy would have been very similar to Mike Rodelli's power assertive personality profile that he created for his Zodiac suspect, Shel Cavale. Someone who is a career individual, an upperclassman, someone who is working in somewhat elite societies and living the double life as a serial killer, the power assertive personality, someone who is rather organized mentally because of the way that he committed the crimes, saying he's taping a barrel flashlight to a pencil flashlight to the gun barrel, as opposed to just shooting the victim in the dark. Someone who showed an extreme amount of crime scene awareness after the Stein murder, walking away wearing rust-colored pants and not getting caught. No, I mean, I do think that the Zodiac was someone who was organized mentally, and that really begs the question about transitioning into the next subject. Was the Zodiac Killer a schizophrenic? I've talked a lot about this one. And when I spoke to Michael Cole, he said most likely not, because the Zodiac wouldn't have been able to do all the things that he did. But one Zodiac Killer suspect that was a very high-functioning schizophrenic is and was Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber. And in last week's episode, I was saying that I'm reading the book Exposed by Mark Hewitt. I would like to continue with some of those observations. And before I share anything about Ted Kaczynski, I would like to go to a comment that was left by Spins and Needles, someone who runs a really good true crime channel, and I invite you to like and subscribe, because this comment is going to be relevant to organized serial killers as opposed to unorganized serial killers, and almost putting the schizophrenic word on the back burner, but I will just read this off. So what is the difference between married and unmarried serial killers? Very little. Married tends to be more organized and more careful with souvenirs, because they have to be. Of course, there are very organized single serial killers. When interviewed, married serial killers do not get excited talking about their wives and kids, just like the single guys try to light up on the planning or hunting, the kills, the pleasure in dominating weak victims, and the high they get from watching someone die. That's their juice. Interestingly enough, the marrieds are sometimes seemingly sympathetic toward their families, and so want control over them. over the information they receive. Israel Keyes was like this. Or was it not sympathy, but that he was embarrassed about his interest in both males and females? In any case, trying to control info seems kind of stupid in light of the fact that they really cannot protect their family from finding out who they've killed and how. Then, there are the weird couples and partnerships which seem to go off in a different direction from the lone serial killers. And yet, in the end, no matter what those relationships were like, it seems that there was a dominant and sadistic tendency that serial killers share with or without social companionship. So no, not all the same, and yet there are not. They are not that far off from one another. Interesting to hear about the shopping cart killer, which you talked about on the Anything Goes Friday segment. And it seems to remind me of another case. I believe that a girl was attacked by a man whom used a wheeled object to carry the body away. He was seen on the street later and caught. A lot of killers use trunks and suitcases and try to transport the body of a victim. Thank you so much to Spins and Needles. And I think that the first connection here to the Unabomber would be, of course, there are very organized single serial killers as well. Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber and Zodiac killer suspect, was not married and, as discussed in the book Exposed, had a few attempts at relationships with women, but all failed, and never had a successful relationship. But there is a certain element of organization in Kaczynski's behavior, as well as awareness. Now, he was given the provisional diagnosis of being a schizophrenic, but more or less, if I can understand Mark Hewitt's assessment of that, is that they were conducting examinations. I believe he was actually interviewed for 22 hours during the examination, and the doctor was leaning that way, but didn't give a 100% diagnosis for being a schizophrenic, but definitely he would have been an organized serial killer. Now, as far as this point here about, so what's the difference between married and unmarried serial killers? Very little. Married tend to be more organized and careful with souvenirs because they have to be. Married serial killers do not get excited about talking about their wives and kids. I think somebody that would have fit in very well with that is Joseph D'Angelo, the Golden State Killer, who was also a Zodiac killer suspect, because he is someone who was very cold, methodical, and calculating. The kind of guy that would wait in the bushes for 4 hours waiting for victims to come home to attack them. No smartphones, no internet, no Wi-Fi, just waiting in the bushes and to attack people. But the story about D'Angelo goes that after he was arrested for being the Golden State Killer, his family came to see him in jail, and he just said, "Get out." He just told them to leave. He didn't want to see them. He didn't want to be around them. Perhaps he was somewhat embarrassed about being caught, but some people think it's because he didn't actually care about his family, and he was just using them as a facade in his life. It's like, okay, the facade is over now. Get away from me. And that is the ultimate response. And I do think that there's a strong element of truth to that. But to shift gears now and talk about some of the ideas that are in the book Exposed, aside from the schizophrenia, Ted Kaczynski is both a Unabomber and a Zodiac suspect. And they talked a lot about the sexual sadism of the Zodiac killer. Even Dr. Todd Grande created a psychological profile of the Zodiac and said that he was reminded of David Berkowitz, how he thought that both the Zodiac and Berkowitz were sexually motivated serial killers, but not actually committing sexual acts with the victims. And with the Zodiac and the Unabomber, there's a strong case that both of them were sexually motivated, yet they were not being very physical with the victims, because the Unabomber is, of course, murdering people from a distance by mailing and sending the bombs to universities and airlines. That's how he gets the name Unabomber. And the Zodiac is being physical with the victims, making some contact with them, but not a lot, yet absolutely no molestation in the crimes. Even if you include the murder of Sherry Jo Bates in 1966, a woman who was stabbed over 20 times, she was not sexually assaulted or molested or disturbed in that manner. Where's the sexual element? Well, it comes from domination. It comes from trying to control the victim. It comes from power. It comes from having this idea of having power over the victims. And I say the idea because the story that was shared in the section of Exposed that I was reading talks about how Ted Kaczynski would spend 100 hours creating a bomb that took 9 hours to create. He would assemble it and disassemble it, and he would just marvel at his creations, and they expect that he was just gently touching and caressing his bombs like a masterwork, and there was something that was genuinely arousing about the bombs that he had created. And I'm not going to lie to you, it's a little bit of a stretch to look at how the Unabomber and the Zodiac are the same person for the following reason. The Unabomber isn't even going to get close to the victims at all, yet the Zodiac did. Now, maybe Kaczynski had the brain to be the Zodiac killer, but did he actually commit the set of murders? Let's look at the theory that's put forward in the book Exposed. Ted Kaczynski commits the murder of Sherry Jo Bates in 1966 because he just lost it. He just unleashed his destructive tendencies, and it came out in a very rough and sloppy way, confronting her in an alley, stabbing her numerous times, and then he was in the category of a serial killer who committed his first crime, not exactly by accident, but in a rough and inexperienced way. Then, 2 years later, there were the Lake Herman Road murders, where Kaczynski was at that point of just thinking that he wants to be a murderer. His primary objective was to kill. And I openly asked Mark Hewitt this question once. Would you put Ted Kaczynski in the category of someone who was a smart guy, but not pure evil, and his destructive tendencies just snowballed and got out of control? And Mark Hewitt said no. He thinks that Kaczynski wanted to become a murderer at a rather young age, and then just had that primary ambition of being a murderer, of killing people. That's what he was about. And the method was not important. I mean, Zodiac committing crimes by gun and by knife, and then goes on to become the Unabomber. It was just purely about practicality, or just committing crimes in different ways, and, as we said before, feeling some type of sexual arousal from the way in which the crimes were planned. And the Unabomber would have more of an ability to commit closely planned murders, or carefully planned murders, maybe is a better way of putting it, because then he can assemble and disassemble the bomb 8 or 9 times, as stated. But the interesting part that I am in agreement with Mark Hewitt on is Kaczynski did not care about anything in his message other than killing people. And the reason why is the Unabomber manifesto is not something that Kaczynski lived by himself. And I really do mean this. I think Mark Hewitt has hit the nail on the head when he says that Kaczynski's talking about industrial society and its future, about how maybe technology is bad, certain elements of civilization have corrupted man. But Ted Kaczynski did not care about the earth or the environment or animals or wildlife or nature. He was a poacher, he destroyed the lands, he abused animals. There's even a story of him stabbing a dog in the buttocks. And I found that there were a lot of conflicting ideas in the Unabomber manifesto, but what I thought was rather interesting is that certain people try to use it as a tool for justification, and it's even difficult to talk about this stuff online, but certain anti-government groups use Ted Kaczynski and the Unabomber manifesto as a way to justify their agenda. But any type of anti-government group in question would have also been rejected by Ted Kaczynski in the manifesto, because he says very clearly that they are not swearing allegiance to the government, but Instead, they are swearing allegiance to the business cycle, and they're doing the exact same process, and they're going about life in the exact same incorrect way. Now, I'm paraphrasing a little bit there at the end, but he identified a lot of flaws in the agenda of a lot of people that would have supported him. And I really began to notice that when I was reading the Unabomber manifesto back in 2020, that it was very clear that some people online were trying to use it to justify a political ideology that would have been not only rejected by Ted Kaczynski, but openly rejected in the manifesto itself. It's almost like people are just picking and choosing. And my initial response when I was reading that was that there are a set of conflicting ideas and that people are just reading only the parts that they want. They're only paying attention to the parts that they want. And it seems like one of the only consistencies in the Unabomber manifesto is that people were supposed to live the way that Ted Kaczynski was living in Montana, minus the bombings, because he says that man should live in a solitary way, man will suffer, but he will do it stoically. Perhaps those elements were things that Kaczynski could have genuinely believed and promoted, and I do think that that is something reasonable to observe. But that is quite different from the Zodiac case. And I want to share something final with you, a final point. On the Anything Goes Friday segment, I was talking about the shopping cart killer, which you heard Spins and Needles mention. The shopping cart killer was Anthony Robinson, a man who has been connected to 6 murders. And let's look at some differences between the Zodiac and the shopping cart killer, as well as the Unabomber and the shopping cart killer. The shopping cart killer was somebody who lured women to hotel rooms, most likely under the pretense that they would be provided with drugs. I don't know if he's offering them drugs in exchange for coming to the room, or he's just getting high with them. One of the victims had meth in her system. That's why I bring that up. But he's luring these women to hotel rooms, murdering them. And with at least 2 of the victims, he used a shopping cart to transport the bodies to a dump site. Now, with Anthony Robinson, very clearly, I think that he was not someone who wanted this grand master plan to get revenge on society and revenge on the world, the way that the Unabomber did with the bombings, or the way that the Zodiac killer did with the murders, the letters, and the threats. The Zodiac killer was not only a murderer, but also a terrorist, threatening to detonate a bomb, to target school buses. The Zodiac was indeed a terrorist. But both the Zodiac and the Unabomber have this element of how they want to get revenge on society, but because they believe that they are smarter and more superior to everybody else. Somebody like the shopping cart killer, he just seemed like a pervert. He just seemed like someone who was committing destructive and sadistic actions toward women, and his deviant behavior escalated over time, perhaps became rougher and rougher, eventually to the point when he started murdering women. As I said, he's been connected to 6 murders. I believe he's only going to face 2 counts of murder. He's only going to trial for 2 of them, but then they're going to attribute 4 other suspicious deaths to the shopping cart killer. One of them was even just ruled a death from cardiac arrhythmia, but now Anthony Robinson is under suspicion for that crime as well. So I think that there also needs to be a differentiation between getting revenge against the world and getting revenge against women. Because with somebody like Anthony Robinson, the shopping cart killer, I could very easily see how he was just trying to get revenge against women. Abusive childhood, almost certainly. I mean, bad experiences with women, almost certainly. Justification for committing his crimes? No, absolutely not. The Zodiac, the Unabomber, justification for committing their crimes? Absolutely not. And that, again, is why it's making sense that there's this idea that, did the Unabomber actually care about his message? No, he was a murderer. He was someone who was sexually rejected by his peers. He was someone who was traumatized by experiments that were performed by Dr. Henry Murray at Harvard, where they were experimenting with interrogation tactics, and they wanted to try and destroy his worldview. All of that. He was someone who was broken, and he got revenge on society for breaking him in his own mind. in his own mind, but in short, the Unabomber was just a murderer, and a rather pathetic one. 3 people were killed by the Unabomber, 23 injuries, but 3 people were murdered by the Unabomber. The Zodiac killer committed more murders than the Unabomber, and the Zodiac killer wasn't even good at that. Multiple Zodiac victims survived, and the Zodiac only avoided capture because he was lucky, because someone put out an APB saying be on the lookout for a black man when the Zodiac was almost certainly a Caucasian. So that's more or less where I have to leave it there. But I do have to give one more shout out to CD, who shared some true crime news with me involving a completely different case. And I just wanted to share this as part of the True Crime Talk segment at the end, and that is about the story of the boy in the box. Much like the Zodiac killer, this is a true crime story that I learned about from America's Most Wanted, hosted by John Walsh. And at the time, I think that it would have been about 40 years since the boy in the box had first come to the news. Now, this is the story of an unidentified person who was found dead in a box, and there has been a breaking development in the story. This just goes to show you that there have been countless new developments in the true crime world this year. It is now December of 2022, and we've seen the disappearance of Brandon Lawson being solved. Brandon Lawson was located in Texas, passed away, sadly. We have seen how Somerton man was identified, the Artesia County Jane Doe was identified, and now the boy in the box, one of America's oldest cold cases, is getting more information. I wouldn't say that the case has been solved, but more or less the nutshell version is the authorities have identified the boy's true identity. However, his name has not been shared to the public yet at the time of this recording, but there could be more developments coming out very soon. I'm going to go over to an article from People magazine. Philadelphia police set to reveal the identity of the boy in the box found dead in 1957. The child, aged between 3 and 7 years old, was found and has been known as the boy in the box ever since. He was found naked and beaten on the side of a road in the city's Fox Chase neighborhood. Philadelphia police are set to announce the identity of a boy who was found dead and abandoned in the city in 1957. The child was aged between 3 and 7 years old and has been known as the boy in the box. Thanks to a breakthrough in DNA evidence, authorities have now been able to retrieve the boy's birth certificate and will next week tell the world his name, so we're going to be looking out for that. He was one of the throwaway forgotten children, Bill Fleischer of the Vidocq Society told the outlet, the longest continuously investigated homicide in the history of the Philadelphia Police Department. A lot of people took interest in this. Fleischer added about the decades-long investigation conducted, which is comprised of retired forensic and law enforcement professionals who investigate cold cases. The news follows an announcement last year that investigators were getting close to solving the case. There have been rapid developments as it pertains to the investigation. We thought maybe he was a Hungarian kid who came over in 1956 when they had the Hungarian Revolution. We had all of these theories that maybe he was in the military. By he, I mean, I think they mean the boy's father. Tragically, the unnamed child's tombstone in Philadelphia's Ivy Hill Cemetery currently reads America's Unknown Child. And, so we're going to be following that story here on Black Box Online Radio, and thank you once again to People magazine. That article was written by Marissa Sullivan, just citing the source. And in conclusion, I would like to share that one day, I hope that they will say that the Zodiac killer case has been solved, that there's been some type of breakthrough, because for years we followed numerous true crime cases. I mean, I'm sure that you have followed things well beyond the Zodiac killer mystery, all sorts of true crime cases up and down the spectrum, and when we see that there is a possibility that these cases can be solved and there can be breakthroughs, it gives us a sense of optimism. But rest in peace to the boy in the box, and even if they have identified him, that still wouldn't tell us how exactly he was murdered, unless the authorities have more information, which they haven't shared yet, and I believe that there's going to be a press conference in the very near future. Well, thank you so much to CD for sharing the news that the boy in the box has been identified, and that his identity will be made public very soon. And in ultimate conclusion, I would like to go to your shoutouts on BuyMeACoffee.com. Anybody who makes a donation or contribution to help support the show will get a shoutout on BuyMeACoffee.com. And the first one comes to us from Batman66, who actually left this as a super thanks here on YouTube. You can also do that. But Batman66 has been a contributor on BuyMeACoffee.com as well. And then we have one from Floyd Black 53, who says, Ned, with all the weirdness happening right now, I go to your channel to relax. It's familiar, feels comfortable, and I do learn things, but it's not so frenzied. Thank you. Have a fab holiday season. I sure hope so, and I hope that this holiday goes as smoothly as possible. Happy holidays to you as well. Stuart McAdam gets our next shout-out from BuyMeACoffee.com, and Stuart says, Powerful shout-out to my favorite YouTube podcast. I did have one question for you, Ned, about the Zodiac killer, which you may have discussed before, but which I cannot find, and that is, what do you think the Zodiac did after murdering Paul Stine? Do you think he walked to his car around the corner and drove over the Golden Gate Bridge? Did he walk through the park to his car? Did he walk into a building where he lived? Would be interesting to hear your thoughts. Okay, so, short answer. I do not believe that he walked to a building where he lived. I thought that people were just trying to make fictitious connections and their own theories to connect a suspect to the Zodiac case who just lived nearby, whether it's Shel Cavalli or Xenophon Anthony. They're just trying to connect him to the crime scene because he's in the vicinity. I don't believe that the Zodiac killer lived in the Presidio Heights neighborhood where Paul Stine was murdered. Did he walk to a car and around the corner? It's possible. And Robert Graysmith even thought this, that the Zodiac had a car stashed and that he got in the car and most likely took off his parka jacket, maybe even took off his glasses if he didn't need them to drive, although Arthur Lee Allen allegedly needed glasses to drive. And then he drove out of there. Or it's very simply that perhaps the dogs didn't catch him, and the Zodiac did tell the truth and he was hiding in the park. So I think those are strong possibilities, but I do not think that he had a residence in that general area, and he most likely had a solid getaway plan, and that's why people think that the Zodiac was very organized mentally, that location could have been chosen for a specific reason. And maybe it's even another commonality among or between the Zodiac and the Unabomber, that they put a lot of thought into their crime bits because the objective was just to kill, and following a pattern wasn't necessary, but the objective was just to commit homicides. But what do you guys think? You can put your ideas in the comment section down below. Anybody can write the show at BlackBoxOnlineRadio at AOL.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook is in the description box, and there was always BlackBoxNid88 over on Instagram. And I will see you there for the bonus podcast. Goodbye.